So, this is Kal Kat, the Kal Katster, and I'm making an update of the generations thing that I did 2 years ago. Yeah, it was a little off, so I'm going to update it. The works of Case and Cappa notwithstanding, and other people that I've written about, the Millennials, since then, have updated the thing. Mainly the people writing about Millennials are Millennials and Y generation people who want to ignore the Y generation, pretend it didn't happen. Well, it did. Okay, so this is an updated version of the that. Colloquially, I call the generation before the greatest generation, call them the lost generation, the flapper era generation that came of age in the flapper era, basically. A little bit before the flapper era. I named a bunch of relatives in there just to anchor the story, but since no one on the internet would know who they are, that's kind of confusing. So in this version of the update, I probably will not do that. Okay, so the flapper era generation, those born 30 years after the Civil War, so in the 1890s, and would have come of age in the 1910s. The mid-1910s, roughly. And then they would have had children about 18, 20 years later. Those children would be the greatest generation, the great generation, those that fought in World War II. Those that fought in World War II. So they're, yeah, they seem to have lined that up. Of course, there's all these other wars in between there and historic events, World War I in the up to 2017 period. There's the flapper era. That's the Roaring 20s. We're now in the second Roaring 20s. It wasn't 1920s. Now it's the 2020s. This is not really the Roaring 20s again, but yes, this is 2020s, another 20s. See the 60s all over again. Yeah, generations repeat themselves, and margin for error repeats itself. Cappa and Case and the other people I wrote this stuff. What amounted to a photo novel, actually. I'm not sure why all the generations have glommed onto it, especially us X generation people, to this guy's photo novel, because it's a British photo novel, and it's not an authority on it. It's just a colloquial term. So if it's all a term for something, it should be okay to sort of debunk it, kind of. You have certain events in history and over history that have changed the course of these events and made them different. You have, after the... Okay, so we have the Great Depression, which was the 1920s and 30s, right after kind of as a result of the extravagance of the flapper era, kind of led to everybody losing their shirt. So it led to the Depression. People spent too much and then they lost everything. That's kind of what happened. So you have that, and that's where it comes from. And the whole world had the Great Depression. It wasn't just America; it was the whole world, and it led to the economic collapses all over the place, and yeah, another war, World War II. World War II was the 1940s. America did not join World War II until 1941, but it was already started in 1939, a little bit earlier. And it lasted until roughly 45, 46 in the 1940s. Yeah, so after World War II, that would be, so the people in World War II, my late father, Bob Brown, would have been in his 20s when the war was over. And yeah, he had children. I have siblings, Robert, Ramon, and Yvonne. Estelle Knapp is his mother. He had an older sister, Martha Mossberger, named Mossberger after she got married, who had children. And everybody, it's not so relevant that I have like people within those generations, but just to say that as an anchor point, they're there. So my father was born in 1925. My mother was born in 1936. So she's a little later, but she still considered herself in the greatest generation, even though it was 10 years later. Well, technically, she was, yeah, a little later, but in that same universe. So yeah, you've got it does appear that Grandma Knapp had children later in life than earlier, so did my parents. So this is a kind of generational thing. Later in life, so she could have had them as early as 1920, but didn't. Even earlier than that if she wanted to, but didn't. The so yeah, more one flapper. Flapper era was also a term for the 20s. That was either of the mobsters and all that was the 20s. Partly that was because of prohibition, and they actually it made alcohol illegal, so that led to the formation of the mobs. But alcohol was illegal for a while, and back then women could not vote. And there was a suffrage movement as well. Suffrage is an odd word, but it means to vote. Yeah, so that's interesting. Huh. So the greatest generation is those that are born that were born roughly 18 years, 20 years before World War II, even according to that photo novel. And that photo novel was, of course, English, so there was a lot of English dates that were more important. The different things that happened with England and Europe, not America. America was a little different. The baby boom in America should refer to the baby boomers, America, born after the 40s, after World War II. The dates for the baby boomers, 1925 to 1943. That's roughly when they existed, when they were born, and when they were old enough to have children, be married and have children. Roughly 16 to 18 years after. 16 to 20 years after. The photo novel was not that succinct, but that's what it is. And their generational gap is similar to that which existed during the X generation, and later on with the Millennials and the Y Me generation. They did this kind of the same thing again. History repeating itself, as that famous pastor was quoted by someone else. History repeating itself. You've got all the stuff that happened after World War II. You got the Korean War in the 50s and the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. The free speech movement of the 60s, the rise of pop culture, science fiction culture, all that stuff. Star Trek was 1966, 60 years ago. You could use that as an anchor point instead of my sister's birthday. You could say, okay, a Star Trek, that's more of a good anchor point. So 1966. It has been 60 years since 1966. There could be 3 generations in there. Now, what they were miscounting is they were miscounting the generation that was actually born in 1966. And they were saying, oh, there's only one in there, and the other one's pushed out. No, it's all of them. So if you were born in 1966, you came of age in the 80s, and yeah, you'd be the first of that 3 generations. You'd be the first of that. You'd be the X generation. You'd be the X generation. And that's what X-Men did and all that. I don't know how you used X generation. Near that can figure is they thought themselves disenfranchised, I guess, like all generations do, and and weren't like the hippies before them. They were a bit too young to be hippies, and to have that behind them. Their parents were the hippies or whatever, or some of them weren't. Mine were older; they weren't hippies. But yeah. So I was born in '70, so I was right on the cusp of the whole thing. So we have. Yeah, so the Vietnam War was between 63 and 74, roughly, 75. The Reagan era started in 1981, 1989, ended around 89. The MTV era was 1980. The cable TV boom, all that stuff. Also cultural events. The 70s and 80s were all the Spielberg movies, E.T. and Close Encounters and all that, Jaws, and all the Freddy Krueger movies, and Halloween movies and all that stuff. Yeah, Friday the 13th movies. Movie era, MTV generation era, the X generation era. That's grew up in the 80s and probably graduated I graduated in 89, so it would have been like either late 80s, 85, 86, 82, 80, 86, around there, or 87, 88. Depending on the margin for error. There is a margin for error because A lot of X-Gen people had kids young, and that threw it off. So there is one or two in the relatives of the generation that, and that threw it off. But of course, the Kal Katster is not the barometer from which the anchor person of the galaxy should be. So we'll ignore that and just say, well, yeah. So yeah. So my youngest nephew considers himself X generation, even though he was born in '86. He's not really technically X generation at all. He's 4 years into the Y generation. But okay, fine. Okay, first of all, let's say that it is pretty much established that Case and Cappa and some of the others, 1962 to 1980 is the X generation. It's roughly where X generation ends in 1980. 62 to 80, like that period. So the beginning of the Reagan era is not. You're coming of age and things are happening. So that's what that means. 18 years, 18 to 20 years. And yeah, the X generation was fancy free and trying to avoid stuff like the AIDS virus and stuff that was going around. So they weren't that fancy free, but some of them, and all that other goofy stuff. So yeah, they were doing things. What throws it off is the current Y generation and the current millennials. And even my last post on the generations was wrong. And they ran with it and they've posted it since then. So you guys got to correct that. The millennials should not be the group between 1980 and 2000. They are pre-millennials, false millennials. They're not millennials yet. Millennials have to be after 2000 because it's a millennium. Millennium comes after 2000. You're post-millennials. They have grouped them together. They have said the Y generation, the Y me generation, which is the generation from 80 to 2000, roughly 81 to 2000, is the millennials. But they also, some of them consider themselves Zoomers. Younger nephews and nieces consider themselves Zoomers. We're not Y generation, even though they are. They're Y me generation. They were the one from 1997. Sarah is as a Y generation, Generation Y, just on the cusp of millennial. Philip, the younger one, he's a millennial. He's a millennial. But okay, let's just group them together. Okay, so we have as an anchor point for the story. So you've got roughly 80 to 1981 to 2000. Well, 98 technically. So kind of on the edge on there with the millennial, with the Y generation. I keep saying millennials. Y generation, the pre-millennials, the Y. You think Y me? That's the Y generation. That's how you remember it. Y me, and the photo novel that this is lauded quite a bit didn't go that high. It ended around 90. There was a 1994 edition and a 97 edition. It didn't go any higher than that. He stopped in 1997. He wanted to write about the X generation. He stopped. So we don't know what he did after that because he didn't do anything after that. Other people have taken up the mantle. Well, you got to fix it. Make sense. Because it's only been 60 years since at the anchor point, it's only been about 60 years since the dawn of the X generation. So you've got the X generation, that's the first 18, 20 years. That brings you up to the 85. And then you've got the next generation, brings you up to 2005. And beyond that, to the next one. So here is the next one. Here is the next one. Of course, Star Trek in 1966, Star Wars in 1977, Reagan era, all that stuff. That's in there too. The Y me generation. They consider themselves millennials. They are pre-millennials. I guess it's easier to say millennials. They are pre-millennials. Yeah. So they're not millennials yet. And then we come to. So by 1986, Generation X has mostly come of age, leading to the other stuff. by the Y-Me generation would come of age in the 2000s because it was like 20 years earlier, and they would then go on from there. They're the Y-Me generation, definitely. Those Pre Millennials are Y-Me generation. They're Y, X, Y, and Z. We're gonna get to Z pretty soon because they're the Millennials. The Zoomers are Millennials. Those after the millennium, those between 2000 and the year 2018, after the 9/11 incident of September 11th, the beginning of the second Gulf War. The first Gulf War was 1990-91. It lasted about a year. The second Gulf War lasted 20 years, with the 2003 roughly to 2022. The third Gulf War is just beginning, so that's lovely. Or possibly World War III, who knows? And yeah, so that'll be fun for the Alpha generation. That'd be fun. Not. So here we have, generation the generation Millennials that grew up with all that stuff and in a different time of unrest, so to speak. The Millennials, the 90s were an era where people were worried about everything. It was to worry about. First, there was a rock generation, MTV generation, and then the worried about everything generation, the Y-Me generation. That was afterward, in the 90s. They came of age in the 90s, late 90s, and there was all kinds of the pop culture, the iconography, and all that tends to go with that. 2000s was a lot of throwback stuff to the 2000s. By the 2010s, they wanted to harken back to earlier periods and Hollywood pop culture and stuff, and look back on that. Mostly because it started by the idea that 2015 was the year that Back to the Future went to in that one episode of the movie. Partly because of that. 2015 was not like the movie. So as we go along the list here, so Alpha generation. I'm assuming that Millennial Zoomer generation thing here would consider the great nephew Donovan be 16. That would be he considers himself a Zoomer, a Millennial, the Zoomer. His little sister would be Gen Alpha. So how we got Gen Alpha? Gen Alpha begins roughly 2015, 2018, mostly 2018, but could be 2015. That would mean that now that it's 2026, they're about grade school age and younger. Generation Alpha, start over, is they would come of age in the 2030s, and they would be kids, basically. They're kids now. Any of the earlier cast from kids. So that's Gen Alpha, and I think everybody's pretty much established that Gen Alpha is indeed the grade school age kids. The weird oddity is that the Millennials that are now in their 20s and late teens have pretty much taken over the internet influencer sphere enough so that Millennial has sort of taken over Y generation, and as everybody's a Millennial from 1986 on, and even I commented on that in my earlier blog, but that's still not right. They're pre-millennials if they're before 2000. They'd have to be. So those ones that were born before 2000 are pre-millennials. Sorry, you just are. You're not millennials yet. You're the Y-Me generation. And Z is Z. It's like alphabetical. If Kappa ever did a sequel and he didn't, but they've carried it on. So that is your generation update. Yeah, and some historical events mentioned in there just offhandedly. So just thought to chime in on the update of the thing, because why not update it and see whether it still makes sense 2 years later? Yeah, it does. So you want millennials. So they kind of just forgot about that other group. I guess because a lot of people that grew up in the 90s after us are kind of like, what are we? Because we don't have a cultural significance. And that became eventually a cultural significance. The weird 1990s aesthetic sort of became its own thing. And it was mirrored in modern sitcoms later on in the 2020s when they were trying, we're going to try to do late 80s, early 90s stuff now. And it's interesting that they didn't get it right, but they did get it. But yeah, it's fun that a lot of ex-gen people are writing for TV and Hollywood now, and you can kind of tell that they'll reference the 80s in their movies, which can get cheesy, especially if only they get the jokes. However, sometimes it's cool and we get the jokes, such as in the Superman Lives remake, Legacy remake thing, when I suggested to the DC people that I knew about. If you show the Hall of Justice and play the jingle, a lot of people are going to watch that movie in our generation. They were already planning to do that, by the way. And so they show the Hall of Justice. I was like, dude. But yes, oddly enough, though, they all ran away from the spinoff, the Supergirl movie, which was set to a 2022 story. A Millennial story that was written about it. They didn't like that. Probably because it was written by angsty Y generation people that grew up in the 90s, and they wanted it to be less angsty, which is weird because the Snyder stuff was angsty. That they would like that. It was a little bit of a throwback to the Snyder stuff. I think what it was with that was, though, that they didn't like that it was making fun of the Snyder stuff. That's what they were on about. Anyway, so yeah, not as bad as Joker 2 made fun of itself. Yeah, that movie was such a mess. But yeah. Anyway, that is pop culture, so reference it. Yeah. Yeah. In your movies and TV and pop culture, don't just rip off earlier stuff. It doesn't ever work. Yeah, it just doesn't work. I remember in the 90s, a bunch of us were like, "Ooh, they should bring back ska from as like World War II jazz." Lasted all of a year and a half. It didn't work. For one thing, it was too hard to play. So the bands were like, this is way too hard. Yeah, so it was too hard to play. Yeah. Anyway, so Millennials thing. Yeah. Y generation's in there. Late 80s, early 80s to 2000. That's the Y me generation. It's Y. And then there's Z generation. After that. Millennial and on. Because it's 60 years past 60. And it's even more than 60 years past the other one. So you could say 62. Well, it's further back. But yes, Generation Alpha are little kids in grade school. Ranging in ages from maybe 10 or 11 to baby. That's kind of what's going on. But yeah, that's Alpha. The other ones are teenagers. Like in semi to late grade school. Teens. Mid to late teens. Mid to late teens. And the other one. Yes. Hopefully not, hopefully the ones that are in their mid to late teens currently are taking precautions. But yeah, I'm sure they are. But yeah, because otherwise the statistics will get all thrown off. And Gen Alpha will be the next baby boom. I don't know if it actually is baby boom 2 like I suggested before. I don't think it is. I don't think the pandemic did that much because I think it just evened out. There was a pandemic in the 2000s, 2020, 2021 roughly. It took out millions of people, but I think they just kind of filled in the gap. Like the Thanos snap kind of thing. They just had, so it wasn't really a boom. Because a bunch of people died, and then a bunch of people filled in the gap. So it wasn't. Yeah, I don't know if it was a second baby boom or not. Probably technically wasn't. So yeah, that's changed. It's not another baby. They're not going to be known as second baby boomers after all. I think it evened out. So it doesn't appear to have been a boom in the past 5 years. Anyway, so that's yeah.